Well, hey there, Bridge Church. It's Jonathan Brooker, pastor of Alive Church, and I am honored to be able to be speaking to you today and to have this opportunity. I know it's really unfortunate, the circumstances that we're in with your pastor, but you've got a great pastor, and he's a great friend of mine, and I was honored when he asked me at that quick moment to say, hey, would you fill in? I'm honored to be able to speak to you, and thank you for joining us. Even though you're at home probably watching this, thanks for tuning in and watching. And speaking of watching things, have you ever watched a movie or a TV show and you kind of felt like the Christian characters they have are just so cringeworthy? Like they're just painfully awkward or just really like not okay. Like they're rude, they're hypocritical, whatever it might be. Like why is it that this is such a thing? Like in movies and TV shows that they make Christians to be such bad people. I know that it could be because they're just unfairly picking on Christians, but I also think that sometimes it's because they've seen what I've seen, and they've looked and they've seen that a lot of followers of God seem to struggle and maybe even not know what to do what it looks like to follow God in real, noticeable, and gracious ways. And I'm not going to pretend, just so you know, today as I get to speak to you, to sit as like an expert on this and teach from my wealth of experience on how to perfectly follow God and be a person who looks like they follow God and things like that. But fortunately, I guess for us, this isn't the first time that this kind of thing has been struggled with. So what you and I are dealing with how does it look like to actually do this thing right is something that people have wondered for a long time, and it's a really important struggle, in fact. And God, in His playbook, has given us some help. And so I want you to turn in your Bibles, if you have them with you, to Daniel. The book of Daniel is where I'm going to be today because I love the story of Daniel and him in Babylon. And actually, I'm just going to start right off from the first two verses and give us some context here. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Judah is part of Israel, which is God's people. So God's chosen people, okay? Well, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, this evil empire, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So I want to real quick point out to you that God allowed this to happen, which is crazy for us to process, that like God allowed for this tough thing to happen to the people that were supposed to be his people. It's 605 BC. And Babylon, the largest empire in the world at that time, this idolatrous society, they worship and serve all these things. They don't know or serve Yahweh, the God of Israel. And he attacks and he defeats the capital, the stronghold of Judah, the people of God. Now, it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around really what's going on here for the people of Judah. The loss of Daniel and his people, what they're experiencing. Like, their temple is gone. Like, I know we've dealt with, in the last year and a half, COVID taking some of our worship and changing it. But for them, like the temple, their place of worship is gone. Their way of worship, the sacrificial system, removed. It's gone entirely. The entire system by which they connected with God, and honestly with even each other in a way, is in ruins. And the most prized pieces of their worship are now, they've been lifted off, thrown into a heap of paraphernalia of all these other gods, of all these other nations that Babylon had defeated. But beyond all of that, which again is hard for us to understand, beyond all of that, they also take about 10,000 of Judah's best and brightest, and they trek them off to go to Babylon and set up new lives there. And now this is important that we really understand this. This is not the same kind of situation as you would see like in Egypt back in Moses' time. This isn't slavery. They're not looking to enslave Israel and have them just do grunt work. These 10,000 people that they're bringing over to Babylon and all, they're looking to actually assimilate Israel. So they're bringing a portion over so they can kind of blend and say, come be part of us. The best parts of you mixed with the best parts of us. See, that was Babylon's empirical strategy for taking over the world. And honestly, it worked really well for them as they were conquering these different people, just taking the best parts and assimilating them in. And so Daniel, to give us the context for really appreciating how you and I are going to understand what we can learn from this, Daniel is thrust into the very depths of a cultural context that runs incredibly contrary to the calling that he knows that God has for him. So does that feel familiar to you at all? Like, you get that at all? Like, he's asking the questions of, like, how do I know what God desires from me? And how do I know what I should do? And should I try to escape? Or should I try to sabotage the empire from within? And should I petition and say, this is wrong that you guys did this? Or should I try to spend as little time with Babylonians as possible? Or should I play it cool and blend in and just kind of fit in? Will it be okay if I speak up or I stand out? And when it comes to speaking up and standing out, are there better or worse ways to do that, right or wrong ways to do that? Like, these are the questions he had to ask. And the reason that's good for us this morning to look at the story of Daniel is because these questions that come up with Daniel and his life in Babylon are questions that we have in Fredericksburg, in Spotsylvania, in Caroline County, or wherever you're from originally. This is, the questions we should have. And the questions about how we navigate the crazy of life in the world that we find ourselves are important for us to ask. What does it look like for us to be the people of God in a place that's pretty godless? We're going to talk today about how being Christian is truly meant to look from a biblical context rather than from like a cultural context where it's like, just be a moral person, be a good person, or maybe even, again, the culture that thinks that being a Christian is being boring, annoying, and hypocritical and judgmental or whatever else. Now, our exile, which I'm going to use a couple times here today, that we find ourselves in here today, it does look a lot different than Daniel in Babylon. But it also has a lot of similarities enough in the important ways that we can still learn a lot. You have some of the same questions to answer as Daniel did back then. And these questions carry some serious weight and are going to make a massive impact depending on how you answer those questions. So let me start us off here then with an important question. What is exile? And this word, in fact, it's interesting. It's pretty key to Daniel's story if you read the whole book of Daniel. And even Peter in the New Testament, as he's talking to believers that are followers of Jesus in the New Testament and would be similar to us, he talks about them being in exiles as well. So it's important for us to know, and here's the definition that I'd like us to have for it today. The state of finding yourself in a context where the values that you have and the vision for the future that you hold are not widely shared. So this kind of state of finding yourself in a place where, the values that I have and the vision for the future that I hold aren't the common way of looking at things or doing things. Now, in a sense, in a very loose sense, it's almost kind of like I remember back in my youth pastor days when we would go on a road trip, and there was the question of, we're getting near mealtime, where are we going to go to eat? And as youth pastor, it was so different than when I was a youth. I finally had the right to go ahead and say, this is where we're going. I want to go here. This is where we're going. And some of my students, of course, liked it, and some of them felt like they were in exile, that they had no choice. Their vision for the future and their values were not an Arby's roast beef sandwich or Chick-fil-A. And if their values aren't Chick-fil-A, how could I follow them anyway? But anyway, the idea is they didn't have much of a say. The vision for the future, the values that were held, were clearly different. And I understand that food might be a silly metaphor, but when you think about it, actually, that's what really does come up in Daniel 1. Like, in the first chapter of Daniel 1, the food that they ate there in Babylon literally was one of the big issues. And the point that I want you to see here is that in exile, the patterns and the rhythms of life, whether they're, big or small, they're just not going to reinforce your values or your vision for the future. And this is where Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and thousands of other Israelites suddenly found themselves. The question at that point becomes, what's it look like to follow God faithfully in a culture that's corrupted? So I'm going to tell you, we'll often be tempted to one of two extremes as we answer that question. The one extreme is denial, and the other is despair. So I'm going to give us two things that we can recognize that'll keep us from each of these two things, denial and despair. So if you got some notes you're ready to take, let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing of these two things is recognize the evil of the empire. For the record, Babylon was evil. Like, with a capital E, it was evil. It was so evil that it was brought up in Revelation, like thousands of years later or whatever, as a poster child for an evil empire culture. Like, it was that evil. But again, just for the record, I want you to know that there's no culture that has ever been perfect and not needed corrected. Like, every culture, including Babylon and including the American Empire, requires Jesus' redemption and his transformation. But there are honestly, some big, scary similarities between the brokenness of Babylon and the brokenness of America. And recognizing the evil of the empire is critical to avoiding denial. Denial where you just go, it's not that bad. See, let me just give you some more context here. Babylon was intentionally a pluralistic and polytheistic culture. And let me explain those big words. When it comes to religion, pluralistic is the sense of all things kind of work, and polytheistic, many gods. So it's this idea of, it means, worship whatever God you want or believe whatever truth you want. Just don't claim exclusivity. You got to be open to all of them. Now, does that sound familiar to you at all? Like, worship whatever you want. That's the culture of Babylon, and it sounds probably familiar to us too. And at one point, that if you look later in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar orders the worship of a statue that he created. And what's interesting is that he's not saying in that moment, hey, listen, you only can bow down to this. You can't worship anything else. In that moment, he's actually just saying, you got to worship that also. You're free to worship however you want, so long as it's in line with how I want you to. Just add this to it, that's all. This kind of view of life and this way of treating, faith and matters of faith is the absolutely necessary, even though it's ironic, result of pluralism. Pluralism, the idea that, hey, we should just be able to we should all worship whatever we want. It's okay, everything's equally as valuable, equally as true. When every way is valid, and that's the only way that you're allowed to see things, isn't that ironic? When you have to be, every way is valid, and that's the only way to view life. And it's kind of posed as if it's like this gracious acceptance of the world, but it's actually not, because you have to believe that one thing, that everything's valid. You can't believe anything else. Now, on top of that, Babylon is also notoriously all about glorying in pride and in power and in prestige and in pleasure. Now, again, does that sound at all familiar to you, or sound like it reminds you of anywhere else you've been or know? But honestly, I'm not trying to pick on America. These are the classic trappings of just about every major empire or any superpower or every big nation. And the danger that I'm trying to point out here, that I really hope that you see, is just how we've been marinated in this polytheistic culture that has established patterns, it does, centered around pride, patterns centered around power, patterns centered around prestige, and then patterns centered around pleasure. Like, it's possible that we wouldn't even take notice to those patterns any more than a fish is going to notice that it's drinking, or it's breathing in oxygen through water, or that we just breathed in oxygen through the air. Like, we wouldn't even take notice of these things. And it's dangerous because as we become enculturated by the Babylon that we live in here, we may live in denial that it's even that evil. We may not see it as that bad, or at least not see certain parts of it as evil. The craziest of things can all of a sudden be normalized for us. We're like, well, that's life. That's how we do things. That's just how it is. And it's probably hard for us to even imagine what I'm talking about here, or what kind of examples there could be, because we see them as normal. Like, we don't think of them as really evil or wrong or needing to be addressed or whatever. We've assimilated into Babylon's beliefs and behaviors. We kind of look at it and it's normal. Now, no one's probably saying here that it's perfect. I understand that you're not saying that our country, our empire is perfect, and I get that. But let me ask you, what are the evils that you see around us, and what are they based off of? Like, what are the things that really bother you based off of? Is it more based off of your personal experiences of hurt, or your personal areas of passion, or your political leanings, or your cultural background? See, that's when it gets interesting on what we find evil. Now, thriving in Babylon requires recognizing the evil of the empire so we don't live in denial. But then it also requires recognize the opportunity of exile. See, exile is a tool that you'll see all throughout the Bible that God uses in Babylon and in history of believers all throughout, again, history, to refine his people. God uses exile to refine his people. Some of the best poetry, the most creative forms of worship, the strongest faith stories, and the greatest acts of good came from God's people being in exile. And in a sense, it's kind of like the scarcity of exile can fuel our Holy Spirit powered imagination for what could be. Let's get creative here. What could God do in this situation? And we see that all throughout history. See, Daniel and his friends were schooled for 3 years in Babylon on paganism. So they had to learn all about the way that that Babylonians worshiped all these evil things. And in fact, it ended up being something that God was able to redeem and use for good, because when Daniel approached the king to give him an interpretation of his dream, he knew how that king would view matters of spirituality. And even though it was so idolatrous and evil, his position and allowed God to use him for something great. And the cool thing is that Daniel sees his position in that moment. When you look at that part of the story, he sees his position and the revelation that God had given him of the dream, not as an opportunity to see the evil, the other magicians and the other wise men get slaughtered, like get what they have coming to them. But instead, he sees his position and that revelation of God as a chance for him to save them. See, that's a common thread that you're going to see when you see God's people in foreign lands. Joseph in Egypt was there to save the people. Moses in Egypt, later on, 400 years later, he was there to save the people. Or Esther in Persia, the great story of Esther, you know? She was there to save the people. They viewed their position as an opportunity to save people. See, Jeremiah, who was like a prophet around the same time of Daniel's life and all that, he had given instruction to God's people, Israel, on how to handle exile. And it ticked off some of the false prophets, because the false prophets were out there going like, listen, hold on, keep your distance from Babylon and all that, and wait, because God's gonna torch the place. Like, he's gonna burn it down. And they were begging people to pray against the city. And Jeremiah 28 and 29, if you want to look it up this week, we see that God is actually asking them to pray for the city. Instead of praying against it, he's telling them, pray for the city. So exile saves us from becoming so dependent on our perfect circumstances in order for us to have faith, being the moral majority in order for us to have faith and have confidence in our God and all that. Like, no, we don't need that. Exile shows us we don't need that. But exile also gives us the opportunity to bring salvation, to bring faith to others. Because all of a sudden we're in there with them. We are knee deep, neck deep, whatever, in the world around us. So I've held off as long as I could, but I want to get to the main idea here. And like I said earlier, we kind of have these two options usually. Denial, it's not that bad. Or despair, it's so bad, there's no hope. Burn the whole place down. Denial is where we try and baptize the empire that we're exiled in. It's not that bad. I mean, I know there's some evil, or I know I did this or I did that, but really it's not that bad. Like, we look at the world through the lens of it's not that bad. We see opportunities, but struggle to see the real evil. We're quicker to conform than to confront. So we need to recognize the evil. But despair comes when we easily see the evils all around us, but we struggle to see the opportunities that God has for us in exile. Despair says, let's just burn the whole thing down. It's a lost cause. You see this broken world, this evil world, this just how bad things have gotten. Despair, we want to isolate rather than infiltrate. But we need to recognize the opportunities of exile as well. So ironically, Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, which is just a business book that you probably may have heard of, he alludes to this idea in a way when he talks about the Stockdale paradox. Prisoners of war were found to have this like strength that got them through their being a prisoner of war when they had unwavering faith that you can and will prevail. But at the same time, they had the discipline to confront the brutal facts of their current reality. So they were like, man, this really does stink. This is awful, but we're going to win. I don't think it's going to be tomorrow. Maybe it'll be a month. And they had that kind of, that sense of tension there. So what's it look like for you to do this, for me to do this? If we aren't gonna baptize the empire or burn the empire, what do? And this is what we do. We bless and resist. Daniel 9, if you look at that part of the book of Daniel, it shows us that Daniel had read up on Jeremiah's prophetic instructions that I talked about earlier for exile living. And in Jeremiah 29, which I mentioned already, there's a command to pray for the city, to bless the city, to spread faith in the city and help people that are in need in that city. And yet, it's also important for us to realize that we need to resist the pull to become like the city and like its patterns. In fact, Romans 12 even says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Don't be conformed to the pattern, even some translations say, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. See, if you enter Babylon, the world, the evil world around us in life, if you enter Babylon and you don't see its evil, then you're gonna miss some ministry opportunities that God has for you, that God wants for you. But also, if you enter Babylon and you only focus on its evil, well, then you're gonna miss some opportunities, some ministry opportunities that God has for you. Instead, God has called you to resist and bless. See, Daniel and the food, remember that? From Daniel 1 where he says he can't eat the king's food? Well, he's resisting being consumed by the culture that's refusing to consume its luxuries. He's going, I can't eat all this luxurious food because I just don't want to be consumed by the same culture. I know if I just give in, I'll be just like it. But he ends up, by resisting, blessing the city with stronger and healthier men. It's a bless and resist. And Daniel had profound discernment, which, by the way, you need if you're going to go ahead and know when and how to bless and resist. And he knew how he could still simultaneously bless and resist. See, Jesus famously called his followers to be the salt of the earth, Matthew 5:13. And salt in his day almost exclusively was used to preserve things. It wasn't used like we use it to make something taste better. It was used to keep something from going bad and going, sour or nasty and all that. So the question when Jesus says we're called to be the salt of the earth is, okay, where in our world do things need to be preserved? This is where we're called to go. This is where we're called to be and to do the work of preserving it. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about preserving a way of life as much as I'm talking about preserving the beauty and sanctity of God's created design for things. And just so you know, and I think you do know this, salt can sting. Like when you put salt onto a wound or something, it can sting. And so not all of our preservation efforts, when we're coming in, we're going, we just want to preserve the beauty and the sanctity of God's created way of doing things. Not all preservation efforts are going to go unchallenged, as you end up seeing a lot in Daniel's story as well. Now, a couple of verses later, or a verse later, after the one I just mentioned, Jesus then says his followers are to be the light of the world. To know the value of light, and what he means by that, I want you to just imagine going into an unfamiliar place that you've never been before and decide if you want to have there be light or no light at all. Because see, light brings peace. That sense of, okay, I know what's around me. I can see what's going on. And darkness brings fear. Darkness allows for questionable decisions to be made, and light encourages integrity. So sometimes our light will attract people. You see that with Daniel and Darius. King Darius loved Daniel, I think because he was a light. And at the same time, sometimes our light will tick off people, like Daniel and the other magicians. Some of them didn't like him. Some of the other leaders didn't care for him. But light and salt are both things that are most important where they're most absent, which makes exile for us and for Daniel such a strategic place to be. See, Jesus said in John 17, when he was praying to the Father, he said, God, I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but just to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong to this world any more than I do. Make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. Just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. And I give myself as a holy sacrifice for them so they can be made holy by your truth. Now, Daniel clung to truth, and simultaneously, he committed himself to blessing Babylon. And at the end of the day, well, actually, like 3 times a day, you'll find out, Daniel would turn his face toward his home of Jerusalem and he would pray, symbolically tuning his ear into God's voice, praying towards the capital of God's people in that day. And it's precisely because Daniel was regularly directed towards the God of Israel that he was best in Babylon. So where are you turned? Like, are you embedding yourself in the word of truth? Where's your relationship right now with Babylon and the evil of the empire? Are you in a place where you're wanting to baptize it and you're kind of like, honestly, I haven't been thinking it was that bad, or I kind of been making a lot of things like more okay and I've been going along with it? Or are you the burn it kind of person where you've been despairing and you've just kind of like, oh man, it just needs to all burn, and you're kind of that? Or have you been blessing and resisting? And like I've already kind of said, it's usually revealed which of the 3 we're doing by which of these we're often feeling: denial, despair, or determination. Determination that says, well, we're going to go after what God has for us to do in this moment. This is our moment. To be clear, I want to make sure you understand, the end result here isn't to be moral. Like, the story of Daniel is not about being more moral. It's about connecting to the heart of God and then courageously living out God-given calling that he has for you. So for us, we need to begin with coming to the Father through Jesus, the greatest exile that ever was, who left heaven for earth and then ended his miraculous ministry by hanging by himself on a blood-strewn cross so that he could bring us hope. And then we also live in the light of the cross. We view then the world and our whole lives in new ways. We begin to prayerfully wonder how we can bless and resist as we go about our jobs and our work. How can we bless and resist as we go about our school, college, or our trade? What does it look like to bless and resist when it comes to social media, conversations, and conflict situations? What does it mean to bless and resist when it comes to sex, dating, and relating? What does it look like to bless and resist when it comes to the pursuit of opportunities that we have in our life, or achievement, or markers of success? What does it look like to bless and resist in how we handle our money and our calendars? What does it look like to bless and resist in our homes, in our hearts, and in our minds? Now, sure, you'll likely, if you do that, have times where you're misunderstood, where you're marginalized, and maybe even misrepresented by other Christians, like we kind of talked about at the beginning. Like, they don't represent you well at all. But if you will follow the life of Jesus, listen intently to the teachings of Jesus, and let his Spirit guide you in that truth, as you operate in that discernment that often delves deep into the details of life and guides us into how to say and how to do and what to do, what God wants us to do. Discernment, by the way, that's so necessary for us to have as we navigate the tumultuous waters of exile. You're going to discover, if you do that there is incredible brokenness in the Babylon around us. Incredible hurt, incredible destruction, and incredible sadness, but that you don't have to baptize it or burn it, but that by blessing and resisting at the same time, you're going to find yourself thriving in Babylon.